"Don't cry, mister. You can borrow my mom." That was what a small black girl said to a man in an elegant coat sitting alone on a park bench on a frigid evening in early December. Snow was falling softly, like drifting pieces of memory covering the frozen lake and the quiet paths, with a stillness that seemed to echo from some long-forgotten time. The city of Philadelphia still glowed brightly with red and green lights twinkling from porches and Christmas music, drifting through the air from corner shops down the street. But here in the old heart of Cobbs Creek Park, beside the lake where children once played in winters past, only a hush remained, the kind of hush that presses on the chest and makes you aware of your own breathing. Ethan Whitmore, a man the world admired as a titan of technology, sat motionless. His cashmere coat was tailored to perfection, a smoky gray scarf wrapped neatly at his neck, his Italian leather shoes untouched by scuffs or stains. But his fingers trembled from the cold, and his eyes were red, not from recent tears, but from forgetting for too long how to cry at all. He had not cried since that one Christmas when he was just 9 years old, sitting in a cold room at a group home outside Pittsburgh, staring out through a fogged-up window, waiting for someone, anyone, to come and take him home. No one came. He was too thin, too quiet, too plain, according to one social worker's words, spoken not with cruelty but with a kind of tired finality. From that moment on, Ethan stopped waiting. He taught himself to stand alone. He built a towering empire in the world of technology, lived high above Manhattan in a penthouse bathed in glass, and light-led million-dollar meetings, signed contracts that made the industry hold its breath. And yet somewhere deep within him, a part of Ethan never grew up. A part of him remained that boy on a bench, small and still, waiting for someone to see him. This year, the loneliness had returned, not just as a passing shadow, but as something larger, heavier, as if the very success he had built with his bare hands had only pulled him further away from what he truly craved: connection. A small laugh rose from across the path. Ethan looked up. A woman in a deep brown wool coat walked slowly alongside her young daughter, who held a grease-stained paper bag filled with homemade cookies, its warmth still visible in the dampness along the sides. They stopped beside a homeless man curled on the edge of the stone path. The mother knelt and handed him a cookie wrapped in wax paper. There were a few gentle words exchanged, a smile, then they moved on. Ethan looked back down, his eyes fixed on the expensive gift box in his hands, a present from an international partner that he had not even opened. It meant nothing. It felt like nothing. Then came a voice, small but clear, rising just enough to pierce the layers of solitude he had wrapped around himself. "Mommy, that man looks really sad." Ethan looked up. The little girl was tugging gently on her mother's sleeve, her eyes still locked on him. The mother hesitated, gave a soft shake of the head, clearly intending to keep walking. But the child stepped forward, her tiny boots leaving delicate footprints in the snow, each step unhurried, full of a quiet determination. She stopped in front of him, tilted her head slightly, and looked straight into his eyes. And then, with a gaze as clear as winter glass, untroubled by fear or awkwardness, she said, "Don't cry, mister. You can borrow my mom." Ethan felt his breath catch as if a sudden wind had struck him in the chest. No one had spoken to him like that in years. It wasn't pity. It wasn't politeness. It was simply a child's pure, honest offering. The mother came hurrying over, her cheeks flushed with cold and with apology. "I'm so sorry." "She's very friendly," she said softly, but she didn't pull the girl away. Ethan could not speak. He just looked at them, the mother and child, as if trying to memorize the moment. A small ember of warmth in the long winter. And for the first time in many years, the cold was no longer the only thing he felt on that bench. If you felt your heart go still for a moment when the little girl said, "You can borrow my mom," then perhaps, like us, you believe that even the smallest acts of kindness can light up the darkest corners of the human heart. Thank you for listening to the first part of this story. Before we move on to part 2, where a simple cookie and a cup of hot cocoa might just change the course of someone's winter, we have a small message for you. If gentle, heartfelt stories like this speak to you, don't forget to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel, like the video, and share it with someone you believe could use a little warmth in the midst of a busy life. And if you're listening to this from anywhere around the world, leave a comment with the name of your city or country. We would love to know where our story has found its way into your heart. And now let's take the next step together into part 2 of the story. The mother stood close beside her daughter, one hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. her expression a quiet blend of apology and curiosity as she waited, not saying a word, simply watching the man's face. For a few suspended seconds, even the wind seemed to hold its breath, unsure what might happen next. Ethan said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed, frozen in that moment, caught between surprise and something deeper, something he couldn't quite place or name. He wasn't used to kindness that came without asking. Generosity without strings always left him feeling adrift. But before he could form the polite refusal that habit demanded, the woman opened the paper bag her daughter had been carrying and reached in to pull out a carefully wrapped cookie, its wax paper folded with care. She extended it toward him, her smile small but sincere. "Merry Christmas," she said. "It might be a little too sweet, but my daughter made it with all her heart." Ethan hesitated, then slowly reached out to accept the cookie. His gloved fingers brushed hers, a light touch that made him shiver, though not from the cold. "Thank you," he whispered. The woman gave a gentle nod and turned, ready to move on, but the little girl stayed rooted in place, still looking up at him. "My mom makes really good cocoa," she said, as if it were a fact too important not to share. "I could bring you some if you want." Ethan gave a quiet laugh. Not quite a sound, more a soft motion at the corners of his mouth. It had been so long since his face remembered how to make that shape. The woman turned toward the girl. "Zara." She called, her voice low and tender, as though to gently signal it was time to go. But Ethan's gaze lingered on the name. Zara. Simple. Short. But it settled into him somehow. The girl named Zara ran back to her mother and took her hand, but before they left she turned and gave him a small wave. "I hope you eat that cookie," she said. "It has cinnamon. Cinnamon helps people feel better." Ethan nodded, the cookie still in his hand, heavier than the luxury gifts he was used to receiving. He watched as the two figures slowly disappeared beyond the snow-covered trees. What lingered wasn't quite change and not quite hope, but something different, something unnamed. He looked down at the cookie, then peeled back the folds of wax paper. It was still warm. He took a small bite. Sweetness bloomed across his tongue, chased by the soft warmth of cinnamon, like a breath he had been holding in for years, finally released. For the first time in so many Christmases, he tasted something not from a five-star restaurant or a catered gala, but from the hand of a stranger. Someone who didn't know his name. Someone who didn't need to. Someone who simply saw that he was alone and wanted to do something about it. Ethan stayed a little longer on the bench, his eyes drifting across the surface of the frozen lake where the lights from nearby street lamps shimmered in gold reflections. The city behind him buzzed on, full of noise and motion, but here in this small, quiet moment, the world felt paused. The cold no longer pressed in quite the same way. The cookie was almost gone, and he folded the wax paper carefully, holding it in his hand, as if it might help keep the feeling from slipping away too quickly. The name Zara echoed again in his mind, along with the memory of wide, dark eyes and an honest smile. That little girl had offered him something no one had in decades. An invitation. No pressure, no expectation, just the simple words, "If you're sad, you can borrow my mom." Ethan leaned back against the bench, closed his eyes for a breath, his fingers still wrapped around the folded paper. And in the hush of snowfall, with cinnamon still in the air, he felt something warmer than body heat begin to settle deep within. The next morning, Ethan sat in his high-rise office in New York, the kind with floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a sweeping view of the city, a view most people could only dream of. But today, that vista did nothing for him. It felt hollow, like looking into a mirror that refused to reflect anything back. Amid stacks of contracts reports and a phone vibrating nonstop with Christmas wishes from international partners, there was one item on his desk. He couldn't bring himself to put away a neatly folded piece of wax paper, the same one he had carried back from the park the night before. It held no value, no logo, nothing that could be monetized or framed, and yet it was the one thing he couldn't let go of. Every time his fingers brushed against it, the small voice of that little girl echoed back to him. And the sweetness of cinnamon, though only tasted for a fleeting second, still lingered somewhere in his chest. A few days later, on an afternoon colder and grayer than most, Ethan found himself back in that same old park. He wasn't sure why. Something had drawn him there, pulling him through the narrow streets of outside Philadelphia, past familiar corner stores and quiet homes, until he stopped in front of the gates of Cobbs Creek Park, as if he hadn't made the choice at all, but merely followed something deeper than intention. And there they were, as if the moment had been waiting for him. Naomi sat on a bench along the crushed stone path, and beside her was Zara, her red knit hat a burst of color against the pale snow. The girl was coloring something, her paper resting on a makeshift board of cardboard. Ethan almost turned away, uncertain, but just then Zara looked up. Her eyes recognized him instantly, and, like the first time, she waved without hesitation. Naomi turned too, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, then softened into a gentle nod. Quiet but unmistakable. An invitation. Ethan walked slowly toward them. "You came back?" Zara said, her smile wide, then reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, folded paper. "I made this for you." Ethan took it. It was a drawing done in crayon, the strokes uneven but full of purpose. 3 figures sat on a bench beneath falling snow, a tall man with a gray scarf, a woman with her hair pinned back wrapped in a brown coat, and a little girl with a pom-pom on her hat. Behind them, warm yellow lights glowed softly. He stared at it. Something in him tightened. A memory stirred with such force that his breath slowed. Many years ago, in another snowy winter, he had received a drawing like this. He had been just a boy staying in a foster home that was never meant to be permanent. He didn't remember the faces of the people there, not really, but he remembered the moment when a girl had quietly slid a piece of paper under his bedroom door. That drawing also had 3 people, and one of them had been him. For years after that single picture had been the only proof he had that someone had once seen him, really seen him. "Don't you like it?" Zara asked, her voice uncertain now, a trace of worry in her eyes. Ethan looked up and shook his head. "No," he said, voice low and rough. "I just wasn't expecting it." Naomi remained quiet, watching him for a long second, as if something in her was slowly clicking into place. "Zara loves to draw," she said gently. "She gives pictures to people she thinks need a little light." Ethan didn't answer. He looked at the drawing again, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat close to his heart. "I drew you," Zara said, swinging her feet in the cold air, "because you looked like someone who needed someone to sit with." Ethan gave a soft laugh. "I think you were right." They sat there for a while, the 3 of them, without rush, without the need to speak much. Snow began to fall again, quiet and steady like breathing. For a moment, Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he allowed memory to guide him back to a long-ago night when a lonely boy received a simple drawing and felt for the first time that he existed in someone's world. Now another child had handed him another drawing, and somehow again it made him feel present, not because of his title, not because of his wealth, but because someone had chosen to sit with him. That night, back in her small apartment, Naomi couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered after seeing Ethan again in the park. She had seen the way he looked at Zara's drawing, not with the amused affection of an adult humoring a child, but with the gaze of someone who had just been handed a piece of something long lost. There was silence in him, yes, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things that had never been spoken. After Zara had drifted to sleep, Naomi remained in the living room, the soft amber glow of a table lamp casting warm light over the neatly arranged shelves of worn books. In the far corner sat a pale brown cardboard box tucked quietly beneath a folded cloth. It was one of the few things left from her mother, who had passed away 4 years ago. Naomi's mother had worked for years as a social worker in outside Philadelphia, a strong, dedicated, deeply compassionate black woman. Throughout Naomi's childhood, she'd seen many children brought into their home for a few nights, a few weeks sometimes, over the holidays, or when the system was too overwhelmed. Each child came carrying their own story, sometimes wrapped in a silence that chilled the room, other times breaking open in tears after the first hug. Naomi never remembered all their faces, but her mother had always kept detailed notes. Something stirred in her tonight. She pulled the box toward her, lifting each stack of folders, every report, every handwritten memo in the round, familiar script she'd grown up watching. Then, tucked between yellowed sheets of paper, she found a thin file bound by a rusted paperclip. The top page was worn, the edges soft and fragile. Temporary placement, December 1987. Naomi froze. Her heart beat slower. She opened the folder. The first page held a small black and white photo creased at the corner. A boy around 9 years old, dark hair, large, solemn eyes, his expression blank, but in the curve of one eye there was unmistakable sadness. Below the photo, typed in faded ink, was a name, Ethan Whitmore. Naomi exhaled slowly as if afraid to disturb the air in the room. Bits and pieces of memory began to surface. She couldn't remember much, she had only been 3. But she did recall a quiet boy who stayed with them for a few days. A boy who barely spoke, who stood often at the back window, staring into the yard, who held tightly to a red wool scarf no one else was allowed to touch. One evening, Naomi had scribbled a picture of a reindeer on the back of her mother's grocery list and left it outside his door. The next morning, it was gone. She had always assumed he'd thrown it away. But now, reading the name, seeing the eyes in that old photograph, everything clicked into place. Ethan was that boy. The man Zara had unknowingly drawn close. The man Naomi herself had once offered a tiny piece of warmth to without ever realizing it. She picked up the file, her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes moved to the final line of her mother's notes handwritten at the bottom of the page. Quiet but polite. Needs special emotional care. Tends to withdraw. Eats little but always finishes his plate. Smiled once when given a drawing. Naomi folded the file closed and held it in her lap. Her gaze drifted toward the bedroom where Zara slept peacefully, then back to the photograph. A feeling rose in her chest, something both unfamiliar and deeply known. This was not a coincidence, not just a lonely man comforted by a kind child. This was a quiet circle, closed at last, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something new. The next morning, as pale sunlight pushed gently through the heavy mist that blanketed the west side of Philadelphia, Naomi stood behind the counter of the small neighborhood library with a feeling she couldn't quite name. The old file from the night before was still there, tucked away in a private drawer like a secret only she knew. The short notes, the black and white photo, and the name Ethan Whitmore echoed in her mind like a familiar melody returned from a distant time. But instead of feeling unsettled, she found the silence inside her curiously calm. Between the long, quiet rows of bookshelves, where time always seemed to move slower than the rest of the world, she heard soft footsteps approaching. Zara appeared, her cheeks flushed pink from the morning chill, a small stack of comic books hugged tightly to her chest. "I'm going to organize the children's section today," she announced with bright purpose. Naomi nodded, smiling. Though she was used to Zara spending every weekend morning helping out around the library, today there was something else in her daughter's eyes. A quiet kind of expectation. A waiting. And not long after, the one both of them had thought of without needing to say it aloud walked through the door. Ethan entered with a cautious step. No one in the library knew who he was. With a navy coat pulled snug around him, the familiar gray scarf at his neck, and a gaze that wandered uncertainly from shelf to shelf, he looked like any ordinary man who had wandered in from the cold. But Naomi knew. She saw the hesitation in his stride, the flicker in his eyes when they met hers across the room. She smiled. No questions, no explanation, just a small nod, soft and steady like a greeting shared between old friends. Zara ran up to him, no trace of shyness. "You came," she said as if announcing something important. "I'm sorting books by color. Want to help?" Ethan gave a quiet laugh, and this time the smile came easily. "I don't think I've ever sorted books by color before," he said. "But I could try." So the two of them sat on the floor beside the children's shelf, surrounded by a growing mosaic of brightly colored books. Zara pointed, classified, explained each title with excitement, and Ethan followed her lead, listening intently, moving slowly, almost reverently. Naomi watched from a distance, not interrupting, but feeling something rise gently in her chest. There was something peaceful in the sight of the two of them, sitting side by side, sharing something as small as arranging books, yet forming an image so whole, so quietly complete, it took her breath away. Ethan picked up an old hardcover, its edges worn and soft. The title, printed in bold lettering across the top, read, "Tales for Brave Little Girls." He opened it. The scent of old paper wafted up, and with it came memory, not sharp, not specific, but in the shape of a feeling. The feeling of being in a safe place where noise stayed outside and time had permission to rest. Zara looked up, her eyes shining. "Mr. Ethan," she said, her voice gentle and sure, calling him by name as if it had always belonged to them. "Can I tell you the story I'm reading?" Ethan nodded. Zara began to tell it, her hands still sorting books, her voice a soft thread weaving images in the air. It was the story of a girl in a small village who found an ancient lantern that could warm people's hearts. She traveled far and wide looking for someone who needed its light. Ethan didn't speak. He just listened. In those few minutes, he didn't think about work or meetings or the endless spreadsheets waiting in the cloud. There was only the voice of a child and the stillness of a place that asked nothing of him except to simply be. When the story ended, Zara smiled, her eyes lit with something bright and quiet. "I think your heart is like the one in the story," she said. "It just needs someone to help keep it warm." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Naomi walked over, placing a cup of hot tea on the low table beside them. "We offer tea to our best book sorters," she said softly. Ethan took the cup. "Thank you," he said, and this time his voice was steady. He didn't ask what came next. He didn't need to. He only knew that he would come back to this place, not for the books, but for a small library, a warm smile, and a little girl who believed he was worth telling stories to. On the following Saturday afternoon, the quiet little neighborhood where Naomi and Zara lived stirred with a rare kind of joy. Twinkling lights were strung across balconies and porches, their soft glow catching in the crisp December air. The scent of cinnamon and warm butter drifted from kitchen windows, fogged with steam, hinting at cookies fresh from the oven. On the sidewalks, children laughed as they helped hang wreaths or carried trays of treats to neighbors' doors, each step a note in the melody of the season. Everything was in motion, preparing for the annual community Christmas gathering at the local cultural center, a celebration built not on grandeur or expense, but on shared food music stories and something even more lasting, togetherness. Naomi was in charge of the children's storytelling area this year. Zara had been invited to read a short poem she'd written herself, standing atop a makeshift stage crafted from old wooden risers. Ethan hadn't been invited. No one in the neighborhood really knew who he was, save for Naomi and her daughter. But still he came as if his being there was as natural as the snowfall. At first he kept his distance, lingering quietly near the edge of the gathering, wrapped in a dark navy coat. His familiar gray scarf draped loosely around his neck. Hands cupping a warm cocoa someone had handed him. No one paid him much attention, and he didn't seem to mind. He hadn't come to be seen. He came to feel something he couldn't name, something he never found in business galas or rooftop New York parties. He saw Zara darting through the crowd, greeting people with the joyful purpose only children seem to possess. Then she saw him and stopped. "You came," she said, as if confirming a vital piece of the evening. "You have to stay till the end. I'm about to read my poem." Ethan smiled and nodded. "I wouldn't miss it." Inside the small community hall, soft golden light glowed from strings of round bulbs strung along the ceiling. Tables were packed close together, topped with trays of homemade cookies, steaming pots of soup, pitchers of tea, and mugs of cocoa sending up gentle curls of steam. Music played from an old speaker in the corner, imperfect but warm. Naomi approached Ethan, still holding a clipboard and a red marker. Her face touched with mild surprise and something else, relief. "You actually came," she said, her voice quiet but unguarded. "I said I would," Ethan replied, his gaze resting on her face where calm and quiet strength seemed to reside without effort. "I wasn't sure you'd be comfortable in a place like this," Naomi said, half teasing, half genuine. "I used to think I only belonged in quiet places," he answered, glancing around. "But maybe I was wrong." They stood beside each other for a while, not speaking, not rushing. Then Zara's name was called. She walked onto the small stage, her hands trembling slightly as she held her folded paper, but her voice when it came was clear and sure. Her poem told of a small tree outside a window, one that had been forgotten in the snow. One day a child came and gave the tree a scarf, a wish, and a little lantern. The tree didn't grow taller, but slowly it began to glow from within. Ethan was still. He didn't know whether she meant to or not, but every image in her poem touched a place in him that had long been closed. He had been that tree. When she finished, applause broke out across the room. Zara stepped down, ran into her mother's arms, then turned to Ethan. "I think you already have a lantern now," she whispered. Ethan looked at Naomi. She said nothing, simply placed a gentle hand on her daughter's back, her smile shining quietly in her eyes. After the performances, people gathered around the tables. Ethan didn't sit in the center, but someone pulled out a chair for him. An older woman handed him a piece of gingerbread. A young boy offered him a peeled orange. No words, just a simple gesture. No one asked what he did for a living. No one needed to know. Tonight, he was just someone spending Christmas with neighbors. And for the first time in many years, Ethan didn't feel like he was standing outside of something. As the evening neared its end, Naomi turned to him, her eyes steady, sincere. "Thank you for coming," she said. Ethan looked around, the lights still blinking softly, the sound of children's laughter echoing from a corner of the room. "I think this time I came to the right place." There was nothing else that needed to be said. Because sometimes one evening in a small hall at the heart of a neighborhood is enough to warm even the longest winters. That evening, after the last folding chairs had been stacked, the final crumbs swept from the floor, and the neighborhood lights began to dim one by one, Ethan still hadn't left. Naomi stood by the door, gently wrapping Zara's scarf around her neck, getting ready to walk her daughter home. Outside, the snow was falling in slow, delicate flurries, catching the amber glow of the street lamps and painting the wet pavement with a soft golden sheen. Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Can I walk you two home?" Naomi looked up surprised, but then nodded. "If you don't mind." During the ride, Zara sat in the back seat, eyelids heavy with sleep, but still fighting to keep her chin propped up as she gazed out the window. When they arrived in front of their small apartment building, Naomi turned to Ethan. "Would you like to come up for a cup of tea?" she asked. "It's late. I know, but I thought maybe you could use something warm." Ethan didn't answer right away. Then with the faintest nod, he agreed not just to the tea but to something quieter, deeper. In the modest kitchen upstairs, Naomi set a kettle on the stove while Ethan sat on a simple wooden chair by the dining table. Zara had already curled up on the sofa, fast asleep beneath a soft blanket, her hand still resting on the open pages of a fairy tale book. The apartment was small but tidy, the kind of place where everything had its place and warmth lived in the details. Childlike paintings hung on the walls, Zara's work, and the air carried a gentle scent of cinnamon and lemon. Naomi placed a steaming cup of tea in front of him. When Ethan reached for it, his fingers brushed hers for just a second. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full alive. Quietly understood. After a while, Naomi spoke. "Where did you live before New York?" Ethan paused. "I never really had a place to call home. I grew up in the foster system, moved from place to place, never stayed anywhere longer than 3 months." Naomi said nothing, her eyes resting on a faint scratch on the wooden table. Ethan continued, his voice quiet and even. Not dramatic, not heavy, just familiar. "One year, I think I was 9, I was placed in a temporary home over Christmas. They were kind, but I knew I wouldn't stay. I always knew. No one ever stayed with me, and I never stayed with anyone." Naomi looked up, her gaze softening. "Maybe someone did want you to stay," she said gently, but didn't know how to say it. Ethan looked at her for a long time as if weighing belief against memory. "Maybe, but I learned early that if I left first, it hurt less than being left behind." The words settled into the room like a cold wind through a quiet hallway, gentle but piercing. Naomi didn't argue. She didn't offer comfort in the form of easy denial. She simply poured more tea into his cup. "You don't have to leave so early anymore," she said softly. Ethan didn't reply, but for the first time the thought didn't feel impossible. He stayed longer than he thought he would. When he finally left, the snow had stopped. Outside, he paused and looked up at the small apartment from the street below. The window to the living room was still lit, and behind the curtain, Naomi's silhouette moved gently through the room. There were no grand goodbyes, no promises made. But as he turned to go, his hand still held the quiet warmth of porcelain, and her words echoed softly in his mind. No one ever stayed, but maybe this time he would try. A few days after that warm Christmas night, Naomi returned to the library with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. Life hadn't suddenly become easier, but something had started to stir quietly inside her, something that felt like hope. Ethan's quiet yet steady presence, the way Zara now woke each morning with a sparkle in her eyes, simply because she thought he might stop by. These were small things, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that rests gently on the heart and somehow steadies it. But hope, as Naomi knew all too well, was often the most fragile thing of all. That afternoon, during her break between shifts, she checked her phone. There were a few unfamiliar messages from old colleagues and a link to an article that was beginning to circulate in the local education community. She tapped on it and felt her heart drop. The piece was anonymous, long, cleverly written, and laced with pointed sarcasm. The writer accused Naomi of plagiarizing the idea for a mobile reading initiative, claiming she had merely repackaged an old project from a nonprofit that had launched something similar years before, dressing it up in sentiment and passing it off as her own. The post included side-by-side images, carefully clipped descriptions, and concluded that Naomi had recycled past efforts for self-promotion under the guise of public good. Below the article, the comment section was already dividing. Some defended her, noting that community ideas often overlap and evolve, but others were cruel, questioning her motives, mocking her integrity. Naomi read every word, Every line. It felt like someone was pressing hard into her chest with both hands. Her palms went cold and damp though the room was warm. She knew where it came from. This wasn't coincidence. The author, though anonymous, was almost certainly someone she had worked with 3 years ago on a similar project, someone she had reported for financial misconduct, someone who was eventually removed from the grant. At the time, Naomi had believed she was doing the right thing, protecting the work the children it served. She had never imagined it would come back like this. By late afternoon, one of the program's primary donors sent an email informing her that their support would be temporarily suspended pending further clarification. A local media outlet reached out requesting a statement. Her coworkers at the library had grown quiet. No one said anything outright, but their eyes had changed. Naomi didn't respond online. She didn't comment. She didn't explain. She simply kept showing up. She read stories to children. She folded paper-shelved books, prepared lesson plans for the next storytelling hour. Outside, the sky was a flat gray, heavy with the threat of snow. Inside her, something was slipping out of place. That evening, after dinner with Zara, soup and toast, the usual, she tucked her daughter into bed and returned to the kitchen. The laptop sat open on the table, the article still on the screen. She had read it too many times. The words no longer shocked her. They just sat there, etched into her vision like markings carved into stone. She didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because she was simply too tired. Then 2 soft knocks at the door. She flinched. No one came by at this hour. Opening the door, she found Ethan standing there holding a small paper bag. He didn't look surprised. He looked as though he had always meant to be there. "I brought gingerbread," he said. "Zara once mentioned they were your favorite." Naomi didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Ethan met her eyes and gave a slight nod. "I saw the article." She turned her face away. "I don't need anyone's pity." "I'm not here out of pity," he said, his voice steady, soft. "I'm here because I believe you." For a long moment, Naomi stood frozen. Then quietly, she stepped aside to let him in. In the small kitchen, the overhead light cast a gentle glow on the table where he placed the bag of gingerbread. Outside, the article continued to spread. The public's trust still hung in the balance. But in that moment, there was only one man bringing cookies on a cold night, and a woman who could no longer hold herself upright alone. And sometimes, just being there, that was enough. A few days after that quiet Christmas night, Naomi returned to the library with a lightness in her chest that hadn't been there in months. Life hadn't suddenly smoothed its edges. The challenges hadn't vanished. But something had taken root inside her, something close to hope. Ethan's steady presence, the gentle way he stayed without needing a reason, the way Zara lit up each morning, simply because she knew he might stop by. These were the kinds of small, quiet things that carried meaning deeper than most would notice. But hope is also the most easily wounded thing. That afternoon, during her break between shifts, Naomi checked her phone. A few unfamiliar messages from former colleagues, a link being shared in local education circles. She tapped it, and her heart sank. It was an anonymous post, long and sharply written, dripping with clever cruelty. It accused Naomi of plagiarizing a mobile reading project, claiming she had repackaged an older initiative from another nonprofit, dressing it in sentiment and masking it as her own. The article placed images side by side, pasted descriptions pulled out of context, and concluded that Naomi had recycled community work for self-promotion. Comments followed. Some defended her, saying it was common for similar ideas to emerge in community work. But others were harsher, more cynical, questioning her motives, doubting her honesty. Naomi read it all slowly, painfully. Every word a weight, every line a press against her ribs. The room wasn't cold, but her hands were clammy with cold sweat. She knew exactly where it had come from, not a coincidence. The voice behind the words, though hidden, was familiar. Someone she'd once worked with, someone she'd reported for financial misconduct during a project 3 years ago. Someone who had been removed from the grant as a result. She had thought she was protecting the work. She hadn't realized she'd bruised someone's pride so deeply they'd wait years to wound her back. By evening, one of the main sponsors of the reading program sent her an email, funding suspended pending further investigation. A small news outlet requested a statement. Her coworkers whispered behind her back. Nothing was said aloud, but the shift in the air was unmistakable. Naomi didn't respond online. She didn't comment. She didn't explain. Instead, she kept showing up. She read to children. She folded origami. She stacked books. She planned the next storytelling session as if nothing had cracked. Outside, the sky hung heavy with gray. Inside, something in her quietly slid out of balance. That night, after Zara had gone to sleep, after soup, after bread, after the last page of their usual bedtime story, Naomi sat alone at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her laptop. The article was still open. She had read it so many times that the words no longer surprised her. They simply sat there etched like permanent lines on a stone wall. She didn't cry, not because she was brave, but because the exhaustion had traveled deeper than the pain. Then came 2 soft knocks at the door. She startled. No one ever came at this hour. Opening the door, she found Ethan. He stood there with a paper bag in his hand, not looking surprised, just quietly present like this was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I brought gingerbread," he said. "Zara once told me you liked them." Naomi didn't speak. She didn't need to. He met her eyes and gave the smallest nod. "I saw the article." She turned away. "I don't need pity." "I'm not here out of pity," Ethan replied, voice low, steady. "I'm here because I believe you." Naomi stood still for a long moment, then silently stepped aside. In the kitchen, he placed the bag gently on the table. Outside, the article still spread. The whispers still grew. The trust of the community still trembled. But here in this quiet space, there was only a man bringing cookies on a cold night, and a woman too tired to hold herself upright alone. And sometimes just being there was enough. The next morning, Ethan returned to New York, not to his penthouse, but to the office he rarely entered anymore, high above the city's glass skyline. He didn't go as a CEO or a public figure. He didn't announce his return. He simply arrived as a man who had spent most of his life learning how to protect himself from harm. But for the first time, he would use that knowledge to protect someone else. He called in his legal team, quietly, calmly. He sent them the screenshots of the article, the manipulated images, the donor's withdrawal notice, a summary of Naomi's program and its origins, and then he asked his tech division to trace every digital thread IP addresses, fake accounts, original metadata to determine what was real and what had been twisted. He didn't want a media war. He didn't want Naomi dragged through it all. He just wanted the truth quiet, clear, undeniable. Within 36 hours, his team returned with answers. The article had been posted from an account indirectly linked to a former collaborator of Naomi's, the same individual she had once reported. After being cut from the project, that person had quietly gathered material, waiting, watching, preparing. Ethan instructed his team to draft a full legal brief, including all the evidence, and send it to both the source of the article and anyone involved in its spread. It was not threatening, but it was precise, it was firm. He also had a private confidential report prepared for Naomi's main sponsor. It included time-stamped drafts of her reading program testimony from former collaborators and official documentation showing her work predated the accusations. Nowhere in the paperwork was Ethan's name. No one knew who had intervened. And he wanted it that way. 3 days later, Naomi received an email from the main sponsor. Their tone was reserved but contrite. They apologized for acting too quickly without due diligence. Funding would resume. In fact, they were considering additional support for expansion next year. Other smaller partners, once silent, sent notes of encouragement. The story vanished from the media. There was no breaking news, no retractions, no vindication in headlines. Just a new kind of silence. This time it was peaceful. That evening, while brewing tea, Naomi's phone buzzed softly. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. She answered, her voice quieter than usual. "Hello? Are you all right?" he asked. "I just got an email from the sponsor," she said, pausing. "They said they've reviewed everything." Ethan didn't reply. After a moment, Naomi asked, "You did something, didn't you?" Her tone held no accusation, just quiet understanding. "I only did what anyone should do," he said, "for someone who deserves to be protected." Naomi tightened her grip on the phone, not in anger, but in something else. "I'm not used to people standing up for me," she said, almost a whisper. "I used to say the same," Ethan replied gently. From the other side of the room, the kettle began to hum. Naomi looked out the window where soft golden light spilled from a neighbor's porch across the snow-dusted street. And for a brief moment, she felt something shift within her. Not weakness, but permission. Permission to lean on someone, even just for a while. And sometimes it's the quietest kind of protection, the kind that asks for no recognition, no praise, that reaches us the deepest. Not because it's loud, not because it proves anything, but because finally someone is there, standing behind us, so we don't have to stand alone. That night, after the brief call that somehow stirred something deeper than words, Naomi remained at the kitchen table long after Zara had fallen asleep. The small apartment was wrapped in stillness, as if echoing the quiet that had settled inside her. On the table, her tea had long gone cold. The soft light from the kitchen brushed across her face, catching the slight redness in her eyes, not from exhaustion, but from a strange sensation slowly unfolding in her chest. Not sadness, not exactly joy, but something unfamiliar, like someone had opened a door inside her that she had forgotten she'd ever locked. Naomi had spent most of her life facing things alone. As a child, she had taught herself how to untangle homework problems, clean up dinner, hide her worries, so her mother wouldn't have to carry them too. As an adult, she kept doing the same. Parenting alone, building projects alone, carrying both vision and weight without asking for help. She wasn't good at reaching out. She didn't know what to do with someone standing behind her, not to judge or fix, but simply to be there. Ethan hadn't just stood behind her. He had done so without asking anything in return. No spotlight, no thanks, no credit. She remembered what he said on the phone. I used to say the same. Not used to being protected, but no one should get used to being alone forever. It sounded simple, but it cracked something open, a shell she had taken years to build. The next day, when Ethan arrived at the library, Naomi didn't keep her usual polite distance. She invited him in, led him to a quiet corner near the children's shelves where the light fell softly across the books, and the silence felt more like presence than absence. Neither of them spoke at first. Naomi looked down at her hands, fingers loosely intertwined, then finally said, "I know it was you, behind clearing things up." Ethan looked at her unsurprised. His silence was confirmation. "I didn't figure it out by accident," she continued, voice quiet but steady. "It's just that no one's ever done something like that for me before, not without me asking." Ethan leaned gently back in his chair. "I don't think it should be rare," he said. "Everyone deserves someone willing to stand up for them." Naomi met his eyes. "But I've never been used to that. I've always had to prove I was strong enough, smart enough, worthy enough to stay in the room, and when you did that for me quietly, without telling me, without needing to, I didn't know how to respond. I still don't. I should say thank you." Ethan smiled faintly. "You don't have to thank me. I just wanted you to know that someone sees your worth. Not because of what you do, not because of how hard you work, just because you are you." Naomi gave a soft laugh, but there was a sheen in her eyes. "I thought I had to be strong enough to never need anyone. But truth is, I'm tired. Tired of always bracing. Tired of always pretending I'm okay. And what broke me wasn't the accusation. It was the feeling that someone was quietly on my side without me having to earn it." A single tear slipped onto the back of her hand, quiet, unannounced. Ethan didn't offer words. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded handkerchief, and placed it gently on the table between them. Naomi picked it up, dabbed her eyes, and let out a watery laugh. "You always seem like you're prepared for everything." "Not everything," he replied, his voice low. "Just the things I think might make someone feel a little lighter." And in that moment, Naomi understood. What made a person feel seen, what made them feel not alone, wasn't a grand gesture or a promise to stay. It was the small, repeated acts of quiet care. She still wasn't used to being protected, but now she was learning to allow it, to not pull away, to not retreat into the silence she had always thought was strength. Because sometimes letting someone stand beside you is its own kind of healing. Quiet, but deep. Late that afternoon, when the last pale sunlight of the day still lingered on the rooftops, and snow had begun to fall gently once more, Naomi returned to her small apartment after a meeting at the community center. The moment she opened the door, she sensed something was off. There was no soft humming from Zara's room, no faint scratching of crayons on her desk, no tiny boots neatly placed by the rug. Naomi called out, "Zara, where are you?" No answer. Her heart started pounding. She rushed through every room, looked under the bed flung open. The closet doors called louder. "Zara, are you hiding? This isn't a game." But in the silence of the apartment, only the sound of her own breath echoed back at her. Naomi stepped back, trying to stay calm. She ran downstairs, knocked on the downstairs neighbor's door, asked the woman who sold fruit at the corner, even checked with Zara's friend near the school. No one had seen the girl. Her hands shook as she pressed the call button for the police. The report had barely been filed when Naomi tapped the second number on her contact list. Ethan picked up almost instantly. She didn't say hello. The words tumbled out with a trembling breath. "Zara's gone. I can't find her." Ethan didn't ask many questions. He simply said, "I think I know where she is." Half an hour later, the snow was falling more heavily, wind slipping quietly through the deserted streets. The old park lay silent, as it always had. Dim yellow lights cast soft shadows on the bare branches above. On the long bench by the frozen pond, where an old scar of memory still lived, a small figure was curled up, head down, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Zara. Ethan approached slowly, his voice softened by the cold. The girl looked up, her face flushed from the chill, her eyes red, though not entirely from crying. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make Mom worry." Ethan sat down beside her, slipping off his coat and wrapping it gently around her shoulders. "Why did you come here?" Zara looked down at the frozen water. I just wanted to know, if I sat here and waited, would someone come? Like you did that day. I remember you sitting here alone, and I thought, if I sat here alone too, would anyone come?" Ethan said nothing. Her words cracked through the layers of frost in his memory like thin ice breaking beneath a footstep. He remembered that feeling vividly, waiting in silence for someone to come, not because you were sure they would, but because you still hoped, and the greatest fear wasn't the cold, it was being forgotten. He gently pulled her small frame closer. "I'm here now, and your mom is searching everywhere for you. I know she'll be upset. I didn't mean to make her cry. I was just sad, that's all. Today at school, a classmate asked about my dad. I said I didn't have one. They laughed. One of them said maybe my dad saw me and left." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. He didn't have any words that could take that pain away, but he understood, deeply. "You know, when I was your age, I used to sit alone on this very bench too, hoping someone would come, hoping someone would choose me. But back then, no one ever came. After a while, I started thinking no one ever would. But then..." Zara lifted her head to look at him. "But then what?" Ethan smiled, and in his eyes there was a warmth deeper than any fire on a winter night. "Then one day a little girl wearing a bear-shaped wool hat came over and said I could borrow her mom. And because of that, I finally learned how to stay, not just how to wait." The sound of tires screeching came from outside the park gate. Naomi rushed in, eyes wet, breathless. "Zara, I'm here. I'm right here." The girl jumped up and ran into her mother's arms. Naomi held her tightly, as if letting go might cause the world to shatter into pieces. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to leave. Naomi shook her head and held her even closer. "It's all right, as long as you're safe." Ethan stood and watched the reunion, but this time he didn't stay at a distance. He stepped closer, and when Zara looked up at him through her tears, she whispered something soft. "You really came." Ethan knelt down, so their eyes were level. This time someone came first. "And I won't let you wait alone again." The wind continued to sweep through the park. Snow kept falling like memories slowly letting go. But there on that old stone bench, something had shifted. It was no longer a place of loneliness, but a marker of return, a place where no one would ever have to sit and wait in silence again. That night, after everything had settled, after Zara was safe once more in her mother's arms, and Ethan had quietly gone home, the small apartment returned to its usual calm, but it was no longer the same kind of calm. In Naomi's heart lingered the echo of fear, of deep gratitude, and of a feeling she couldn't quite name. The next morning was Christmas Eve. Snow continued to fall soft and steady like a white blanket gently covering the city. Naomi rose early, tiptoeing out of the room to prepare breakfast. Zara was still asleep, her small face quiet on the pillow, breath warm and even. Naomi stood watching her for a long moment, as if to remind herself it had all just been a bad dream, one that had passed. The morning drifted by with small tasks, cleaning up baking cookies, fixing a string of lights on the little tree in the corner of the room. The tree was old, barely reaching 5 feet, and had been with them for many years. Each year they added one handmade ornament, one new memory. This year's was a crooked star made of cardboard and silver foil, crafted by Zara, clumsy but sparkling. Naomi didn't expect much for the evening, probably just a simple dinner, then the two of them would curl up and watch a Christmas movie like they always did. But as the clock struck 7, the doorbell rang. Zara ran ahead, still wearing a flour-dusted apron, murmuring guesses that it was a delivery driver, or maybe someone from the neighborhood. But when the door opened, both mother and daughter stood silent for a moment. There stood Ethan in a charcoal-colored coat, snow still clinging to his hair and shoulders. He didn't come empty-handed. In his arms was a small, real pine tree wrapped in a string of soft yellow lights that shimmered like stars in the winter dusk. It tilted slightly to one side, not perfect, but alive and warm. Ethan looked at Naomi, his voice low, with a hint of hesitation. "I know you already have one tree, but I thought maybe one more could make it a forest." Zara burst into laughter, then cheered like she had just discovered treasure. "A backup tree, I told you, didn't I? He's the kind of guy who brings a spare tree. Naomi laughed too, the kind of laugh that softened her face like something heavy had quietly been set down. Ethan still stood there, unsure if he had gone too far, but Zara had already run back inside, clearing a space next to the old tree. Mom, let's put the new one right here. 2 trees side by side really do look like a tiny forest. Naomi leaned slightly, her smile gentle. Come in, Ethan. Stay for dinner with us. He stepped inside, carefully placing the new tree beside the old one. In the warm glow of the room, the 2 trees side by side formed a small glowing corner, nothing grand or elaborate but full of light and life. Zara began hanging leftover decorations, then suddenly stopped. She turned to Ethan, eyes bright with something deeper than joy. Uncle Ethan, maybe you don't need to borrow Mom anymore. Maybe you can just stay. Ethan stood still. No one spoke for a moment. The words hadn't been rehearsed, hadn't been said loudly, but they rang out clear as a door opening from a small, brave heart. Naomi looked at him, her eyes no longer guarded. Only understanding remained and a quiet permission that didn't need words. Ethan bowed his head slightly and nodded. He looked at Zara, then at Naomi, and spoke in a quiet but steady voice. I'm not borrowing anymore. I'm staying. There was no applause, no Christmas music playing in the background, only the soft scent of cocoa drifting in from the kitchen, the sound of Zara humming as she hung ornaments and the golden light casting 3 gentle shadows close together. In a small apartment tucked away in a corner of the city, 3 people looked toward a slightly leaning Christmas tree and knew that this year Christmas was truly complete. Not perfect, but whole. That evening passed in a warmth that felt rare and precious, the spirit of Christmas seeping into every quiet corner of the apartment, not just through the glow of string lights or the faint scent of cinnamon drifting from the oven, but through the full presence of 3 people who were no longer strangers. They sat together, needing few words, sharing cookies and scattered conversations about childhood memories, about small things that somehow carried the weight of something deeply real, deeply close. And then, as if to close the holiday season with a sense of quiet completion, the next morning was the Christmas performance at the elementary school where Zara studied. The year-end recital the children had been excitedly preparing for over the past several weeks. Naomi carefully tied her daughter's shoes while Zara, unable to hide her nerves, kept fiddling with the little silk scarf tied around her neck, part of her costume for the play. Do you remember your lines? Naomi asked, gently resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Zara nodded quickly, her eyes bright and clear. I remember everything, but if I forget, I'll borrow the light. Naomi didn't ask what she meant, she simply smiled. That line, Zara had come up with it herself when she rewrote the final scene of her class's small play. She had called it The Girl Who Borrowed Light. To adults, it might have sounded like nothing more than a poetic image. But to Zara, it was an entire world. The auditorium was filled to capacity, soft golden stage lights spilling onto the small wooden platform, decorated with hand-drawn Christmas trees and dangling paper stars made by the students. Ethan sat in the front row among parents and family members. He wore a simple shirt, had no bodyguards, no phone, no laptop. Only his eyes watching the small face peeking out from behind the curtain. When the velvet drapes opened, the soft strains of Christmas music began to play, and one by one the children stepped onto the stage, each with a role to play. Zara was the last to appear. Alone on stage, she played a child who had lost her light and wandered through darkness in search of it. The story was not complicated. The child walked through a forest of fears, met strange and kind people, each offering her a piece of light, a song, a hug, a story warm enough to carry her a little further. And finally, when she stood alone in the last shadow of the play, the stage light narrowed into a single golden beam resting on her face. The girl lifted her head toward the audience, her voice rising into a hush that fell over the crowded room. When you're lost in the dark, you can borrow someone else's light until you shine again. No one laughed. No one clapped right away. That line pulled tight a thread of emotion in every person sitting there. Ethan sat still, eyes unblinking. He didn't cry, but something inside him, something long locked away, quietly opened. He remembered himself as a child sitting in a dark room, too afraid to hope, too unsure that anyone might ever offer him a little light. But Zara, this child, had done that without ever being taught. One more spotlight flicked on, then another. More children stepped forward, circling her. And then came the applause. First one person, then two, then the entire hall. Ethan stood saying nothing, but his eyes found Naomi standing at the side of the stage. She was crying, her hand clenched softly at the hem of her blouse, her gaze fixed on her daughter. This wasn't just a school performance. It was the moment a little girl used her small voice to warm an entire room full of grown people who had forgotten how to believe in light. And Ethan understood then that Zara was no longer simply the girl who once lent him a small kindness on a winter day in the park. She was the one who reminded him that light is not just something you carry. It's something you can give even in the smallest amount. After the final scene, after the music stopped and the audience spilled into the hallways with laughter and praise, Ethan remained where he was, still holding the creased program in his hand, eyes still resting on the spot where the little girl had stood. He didn't need the stage lights. He didn't need applause. To him, that child had just done something no one else ever had. She had lent him a spark and made him want to hold on to it, never let it go again. That afternoon, after the performance, snow fell thin and silent, like a breath of mist settling gently across rooftops and tree branches, softening the world with its quiet touch. Ethan didn't drive straight home. Instead, he took the long way, circling past the park down familiar streets now colored by memory. And when his car stopped in front of Naomi's small apartment, he didn't get out right away. He sat there, hands resting on the wheel, but his thoughts drifting somewhere far off where Zara's clear voice still echoed in his mind. When you're lost in the dark, you can borrow someone's light until you shine again. He looked up at the window, still glowing with that warm golden light. Through the sheer curtains, Naomi's silhouette passed by, and laughter light and distant spilled down into the quiet street. It was the sound of a home. Not something Ethan had ever truly known, but now something he found himself longing for. He climbed the steps. Before he could press the doorbell, the door opened. Zara stood there, hands tucked behind her back, her eyes bright with a secret kind of joy. "Mom told me not to open the door unless I know who it is, but I saw your car through the window, so I figured it was you." Naomi appeared behind her, still wearing oven mitts, a dusting of flour across her cheek. She looked like she was about to say something, but Ethan raised a hand first, as if afraid to break the rhythm of the moment. "I didn't bring anything today. No cake, no flowers, just, if you still have room for an uninvited guest, I thought maybe I'd like to sit with you a little while longer." Naomi didn't answer right away. Then she stepped back, holding the door open, and smiled. "Come in, we're making cocoa." In the living room, Zara was fussing with the lights on the little tree, now leaning even further to one side beneath a pile of paper-wrapped gifts. When Ethan set his coat over the back of a chair and sat down, she immediately pulled him toward the tree. "You have to help me hang this." She held up a paper star, lopsided and glitter-covered, its edges uneven. "I made it yesterday. It's for you." Ethan took it in his hands, turning it gently. It wasn't perfect. The lines were rough, the colors smeared, but something in the way Zara looked at him made it the most precious thing he'd ever been given. He hung it on the highest empty branch. Just then, Naomi placed 3 ceramic mugs on the table, each filled with hot cocoa white whipped cream floating on top. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla drifted through the air. They sat together, the 3 of them, Zara in the middle, feet swinging above the floor, arms wrapped around her mug. Naomi leaned back slightly, her eyes never straying far from Zara, though sometimes they paused quietly on Ethan. As he took his cup, his hand brushed against hers. They didn't speak of what had passed. They didn't talk about work or fame or the old hurts they carried. They simply sat there in the hush of the evening while snow fell steadily outside and something inside each of them quietly softened. Suddenly, Zara jumped up and ran to her room. She rummaged through her backpack, then came back holding a folded piece of paper still smudged with watercolor. She opened it and placed it in Ethan's lap. "I drew this today. It's you, my mom, and me. We're sitting on the stone bench in the park, like the first time we met." Ethan looked down at the drawing. It was clumsy, childlike, but unmistakable. 3 figures sitting together in the snow under a sky strung with lights. All 3 were smiling. The feeling that rose in his chest was like a wave, something familiar and strange all at once, a memory being created in real time. He turned to Naomi, his voice low and careful, as if he feared breaking something sacred. "I don't want to borrow anymore." Naomi didn't speak, but she reached out, took his hand in hers, and held it with a quiet strength that said she understood everything. And so they stayed. No promises, no binding words, just presence. And somehow, that was enough. In that small room, a new kind of home had formed. Not perfect, but real. Truly finally a home. Under the gentle light of Christmas morning, the little apartment was filled with a warmth that came not from the heater or the mugs of hot cocoa, but from something deeper, something quieter. Ethan sat by the window silently watching as Naomi and Zara worked together to hang the last of the tiny red wreaths on the tree. The room felt suspended in time, as if the world had paused for just a moment to let its inhabitants breathe more slowly, to feel every piece of the morning in its full rounded grace. None of them were perfect. Ethan carrying a past heavy with hurt and long, silent years that had nearly buried his ability to love. Naomi marked by the quiet fatigue of a strong single mother who had learned to carry more than her share. And Zara, a little girl growing up in a world where there had never been a father to call her own. But somehow they had found each other. They did not rescue one another. They simply showed up at the precise moment someone needed to be seen, to be heard, to be touched by a softness that asked for nothing in return. And in that simple presence, 3 separate lives became a family. Not by blood, but by choice. The story of Ethan, Naomi, and Zara is a reminder of a truth both simple and profound, that sometimes a small act can change the course of someone's life. An invitation to sit down. A hug in the middle of a snow-filled night, a cup of cocoa shared at just the right time. These quiet gestures, easily overlooked, can be the only light someone needs to take the next step. In a world often rushing and bruised, we forget the power of kindness, of being there without conditions. And the truth is, all of us have at some point been lost. Sat quietly in the winter of our own lives, waiting, hoping for a hand to reach out, for a seat to be offered beside someone else's warmth. So if you've ever borrowed someone's light to get through your darkest day, or if you've ever been the one to share your light with someone else, then this story is for you. What did you feel on the journey of these 3 souls who seemed so unrelated, becoming a new kind of family? Did it remind you of someone in your life? Have you ever invited someone to borrow your mother? Or felt even once what it means to be allowed to stay instead of being left behind? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below, here at Emotional Echoes. We are always listening for stories from the heart. If this story touched you even just a little, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing the video so that more people can be warmed by stories like this one. Every day. Emotional Echoes brings you a new emotional journey, a small but powerful slice of life to remind you that kindness is still all around us. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you good health, peaceful days, a spirit that feels light, and a heart warm enough to love and be loved. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video from Emotional Echoes.